Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to continue our journey to Endgame with part 16, and we will look at the sequel to 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And we'll see returning characters, Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, played by Chris Pratt, Gamora, played by Zoe Saldana, Drax the Destroyer, played by Dave Bautista, Rocket Raccoon, CGI but voiced by Bradley Cooper, and a new baby form of Groot that is again voiced by Vin Diesel, although it seems like it's voiced by him through a very serious modulator. And also with Michael Rooker returning as Yandu Udanta, and new characters appearing, such as Ego, who is played by Kurt Russell, and Sylvester Stallone, who has a cameo appearance as the leader of the Ravager clans. So this is the direct follow-up, essentially, to the 2014 Guardians of the Galaxy. Again, Guardians weren't involved in Avengers 2. We really haven't checked in with them at all since that first film. They don't get really involved in the main fray of Marvel until Infinity War. So this is our next checkup, and ultimately the film does. The first film had a perfect balance of comedy and action, in my opinion. Um, and I think it did a really good job. The jokes were funny. The action was enjoyable. In this one, I feel they lean a bit too much on the comedy, and I'll kind of explain that as we go through the film. But the first part, where we are introduced to the Guardians, is basically their kind of. I don't know exactly what the stipulations are, but they're selling themselves out almost. Basically, they go to this planet. It's populated by these golden people. I believe they're supposed to be the race of Adam Warlock, which they have a little hint to in a post-credit scene. But they wind up having to protect this power source, these batteries, from this creature that they don't really give any explanation to. It's just there to devour the batteries or whatever. And they manage to defeat the creature in fairly comedic fashion. And the opening segment has Mr. Blue Sky from Electric Light Orchestra, which is really, really funny. Again, the music choices in this film, just like the first film, are perfect in many, many ways. Um, and they flood the movie with classic, light rock music from the 70s and the 80s, even some from the 60s, now that I think about it. But they do this, and basically their payment is they get Nebula. Now who's Gamora's sister from the first Guardian. She's also the second daughter of Thanos. And basically, we don't really know what's been happening with Nebula since. Uh, they get her, and there's really the whole point is that they're going to deliver her to the Nova Corps. That's the whole idea behind why they're going to get her. She has a heavy bounty on her head, and they're going to deliver her to the Nova Corps to basically rot in a prison cell. She also still has not had her hand repaired from the end of the original Guardians of the Galaxy when she cuts it off. So basically, they go through this whole thing. There's a really weird sex joke in there, but after that, we find out that Rocket has apparently swiped some of the light batteries that this race has, and he plans on selling them on the black market. Now, here's kind of the thing that bugs me a little bit about this movie is that they leave, and then they are immediately pursued by an entire fleet of these ships from this race. And he stole three batteries, and they show that there are literally what looks to be hundreds of them. I would assume. I mean, I'm assuming there's not 10 batteries on the planet, and he stole three of them. Um, there's a ridiculous amount of ships that go after them for the course of three batteries, and then of course all the ships wind up getting destroyed. But the first part of this movie is essentially kind of the separation of the Guardians and kind of exploring because they have a family dynamic almost, and they even say that later in the film. But the whole idea of this early part is that they want to separate them essentially and kind of fracture them on an emotional level, and then have them come back together at the end. And you see that where there's a lot of friction between Peter Quill and Rocket Raccoon, where they are essentially just mean, horrible people to each other. And actually, uh, there's a scene later on where he calls him a raccoon, and then he corrects himself and says he's a trash panda. And Rocket obviously has no idea what that means. But Peter Quill kind of tells him that, oh no, it's a lot worse than raccoon. It's like terrible. It's like slang for raccoon. Um, it is a funny joke in the film, but some of the humor does land, some of it does not. There's a lot of jokes that kind of feel like they carry on too long in the course of the film. There's a lot of stuff with Drax that is very cringy, that I don't really enjoy. Some of it is funny, but they've definitely humored him up more since the first film, and it doesn't always work. Um, going past where they escape from they go through this asteroid field, and they get saved by this random guy. They have no idea who he is. He's literally riding a giant, what looks like an egg-shaped ship next to them, and he manages to destroy the remaining ships that are trying to hunt them down, and he then has them disappear through what looks like a light speed portal thing. Again, they never really explain kind of the way that they travel in this universe. They just sort of uh, show like they kind of like go through these portals, and then it's short little jumps. It's kind of strange, but they go through one of these portals and they crash land on this world, and they wind up meeting this guy who basically who's identifies himself as Ego, again played by Kurt Russell, who comes in and basically says that he's Peter Quill's father. And he gives a little bit of an explanation, which he then expands on later on in kind of a gratuitous way. And actually, before I keep going there, I've completely forgot that there is actually a scene at the very beginning of the film where we kind of see a de-aged Kurt Russell, which again they've kind of perfected that technology over the years, of the de-aging people, and a de-aged Kurt Russell and Meredith Quill, who's Peter's mother, and they kind of set up the whole thing where he plants himself on various planets for pieces of him, which is then explained later as Ego is essentially a massive planet-sized being who transplants pieces of himself onto other worlds. Um, but going past that, we get some moments between Peter and Ego. Peter is initially very skeptical, and this is also kind of where we have the development of his relationship with Gamora, where Gamora is essentially kind of encouraging Peter, like you should explore this. You shouldn't just shoot this down because this is what you've always wanted. This could be your father. Um, and she's essentially being supportive of him, which kind of enhances that romantic tension that they have. So long story short, Rocket and Groot stay behind to fix the starship and try and get it back up and running so that they can move around if they have to. And Peter, Gamora, and Drax go with Ego back to his planet. So now that we have that situation, oh, and also Nebula is also with Rocket and Groot too. She is still in handcuffs. Um, they go back to Ego's planet, which is literally him. Now, in the comics, he's actually referred to as Ego, the Living Planet, because he's actually the size of a planet. And there's a few little nods to that. There's a portion where they show the planet. It has like a face on it where it looks like Kurt Russell. But essentially, the early parts of this movie are kind of building up the relationship, a few different relationships, which they do expand on quite much, which really is mainly Yondu, Rocket, Peter, and his father are the majority of them, and there's a bit between Nebula and Gamora. But the thing with this film is that sometimes that humor doesn't really hit. It doesn't hit correctly, or it's used in a point where it's not very appropriate. Um, because there are a few scenes that come up with it, but I'll go into them a little bit later. But uh, Rocket stays behind, and the Ravagers wind up finding out that they have a bounty on them, so they decide to hunt them down. Now, Yondu decides that he is not going to kill them because if he kills them, This is after some escapades. He manages to corner Rocket essentially, and that also means he corners Groot because Groot is a little tiny baby Groot in this one because he's trying to grow back from the events of the first Guardian still. Um, he decides not to kill them because he realized that the Nova Corps would then hunt them down and try and kill them. So instead of doing that, he offers to simply take the batteries and leave them alone, and then sell them on the black market. Now, this is where we get kind of this interesting little subplot where there's kind of a rift in the Ravagers, where some of them aren't confident in Yondu, because he constantly lets Peter Quill essentially betray him and get away with stuff, when he should be more hardcore. Essentially, they think he's losing his edge. And one of the Ravagers who, and again, this is one of those things where the humor doesn't really hit. His name is Taserface, and they play this up as a joke throughout the entire film. Like the fact that his name is some like pants shittingly hilarious thing. It's like, no, the guy's name isn't like Ballface or something. It's not something that would get a chuckle out of you. His name is Taserface. Like, it's stupid, yeah, but it doesn't make you want to, chuckle and laugh and like crap yourself, which is again how they play it up. But basically, he leads the mutineers, and Nebula shoots off Yondu's fin that's on the top of his head, allows him to control his arrow. So now Yondu is incapacitated. And Groot are taken prisoner, and they're basically thrown into Yondu's ship, and they're going to get handed over to the Kree because the Kree have a very heavy bounty on them, from the events of Guardians 1. So while they're doing that, basically Peter Quill has these bonding moments with his father, in on Ego's planet, and some of them work, some of them don't. The point where they're talking about the song Brandy, is really interesting because he's comparing, like, oh no, you and me are the sailor, and all that stuff, and we're the ones that showed up with gifts and stuff like that. And he's teaching Peter life lessons, which is very interesting. And again, Kurt Russell does this very, very well. Um, Now, a portion that doesn't work so well is there's a section where they walk through this hall that has these little like visual things, that look almost like kind of like weird 3D animations, where Ego explains his trip through time essentially because he's immortal almost. He goes back to before the beginning of time. So he shows these things, and it would be. I think it's more just to keep your attention, and I kind of get that, but it feels a little clunky where he's telling Peter these things as Peter is being shown them, through these visual aids almost. And I feels like it's exposition, but it's exposition that's done essentially with like a shiny object jiggling in front of your face to keep your attention. And it that doesn't make it clunky, not clunky exposition. Like, I get that we need to kind of learn about Ego and stuff like that, but it probably would have been better to just have like a heart to heart with Peter, and he would learn this information and stuff like that instead of doing this whole, almost like a marionette show, in front of us. It feels kind of strange. So moving past that, we have these moments. There's a really cringy moment, where it's supposed to be, Peter has this whole thing where he makes a joke earlier on in the film about how all the other kids, they were playing catch with their dads, and how he said that his dad was actually David Hasselhoff, and stuff. But there's a scene where he literally plays catch with a light ball, a ball that's made out of physical light, with Ego, and it it looks really cringy because you can tell they're catching something that isn't real. They don't really sell it as much as I think they probably could have, if it was a solid object with some kind of like a green layer or something over it. But what kind of happens in this scene is that we understand more about what the Celestials do, because the whole reason why Peter, was found out by Ego is because he held an Infinity Stone, in the first Guardians. He held I believe it was the Life Stone in the first Guardians, and he didn't die. So Ego sought him out and found. Now he has found him, but the whole thing is he is, Peter, because he is, a blood relative of Ego, is connected to the planet's core, and he can harness its power. and he also has power himself, which is connected to the planet's core. So that's the whole point why Ego is bringing him here now, is that he wants to teach him how to, he's, well, at least he's leading on that he wants to teach him how to use his celestial powers. This is also the first time we really see a living celestial in the Marvel universe. Nowhere, the place Nowhere, which is the severed head of a celestial, is out there, which, but that one is dead. We also have some visuals of some other ones, like with the Life Stone. There's a visual of one that uses it on a scepter and destroys a planet and stuff. But this is the first time we really see a celestial that's living, that can actually communicate in some form. So, moving past those events, we have, essentially Gamora is getting very concerned with what's happening between Peter and Ego, because something doesn't seem right. And the reason why is they've been introduced to this character called Mantis, who is an empath. And she, for those people that don't know what that is, it's somebody that can can feel and manipulate other people's emotions, and that's basically what her powers are. And the only reason why she is around is basically she helps Ego go to sleep, which is weird, and they never explain why he needs help to go to sleep. But it feels like a way to just shoehorn her into the film, because she was a prominent character in the Guardians comic books back in the early days. So she's there, but she knows something she's not telling anybody. And it all links into Peter's past, where Yondu picks him up from Earth and never delivered him to Ego. And that really is the crux of what the plot is that whole beginning of the story, and trying to find out, what was the reasoning behind not dropping Peter off with his father, what was the reasoning behind kind of going what was the reasoning behind Ego leaving Earth, and all that, and never coming back. And basically, it's all kind of filling in the blanks for Peter's past and seeing like what happened exactly. And by the end of the film, we know the exact series of events. Um, Now, meanwhile, while all this is happening, Nebula has taken a spacecraft from the Ravagers, and she's basically going to go to Ego's planet. And again, they say, "Oh, we have the coordinates for Ego's planet." It's like, how did you get those? Because they have a scene where Kraglin, who's the second in command of the Ravagers there, gives her she says, "Oh, we have the coordinates for Ego's planet." Actually, no. Now that I think about that, they have the coordinates for Ego's planet because they were going to drop Peter Quill off there as a kid. So I just answered my own question. That was kind of dumb. But going forward, you have Ratchet, uh, Yondu, and Baby Groot, who are all on board the Ravager ship, and they're going, like I said, they're going to ship them off to the Kree, because the Kree have a heavy bounty on them from the first film. So Rocket and Yondu have to break out, but they need to get the fin for Yondu's head. Now, this is actually a really funny series of events where they send Baby Groot out to get the fin, and they tell him where it is, but he keeps like getting lost and bringing back wrong things. It's actually it's goofy, but it does work. It's one of those moments of humor that really does work for the film. Um, but you have this kind of back and forth, and then eventually Yandu gets the fin, and that is when all fucking hell breaks loose, and probably the coolest scene in the entire movie takes place, where Yandu single-handedly eliminates the entire Ravager crew, almost, except for Kraglin. He eliminates all the other ones because they killed all of the loyalists. They launched them all into space. So all the ones that are on board now, except for Kraglin, are all loyal to Taserface. So Yondu proceeds to kill every single one of them. Actually, Ratchet kills some too, and Groot kills a couple, but he kills every single member of the Ravager crew that is left on board the ship. And then they proceed to separate the front of the ship, because I guess the ship is modular. Again, they never really explain that. He just sends Kraglin off. He says, "Oh, get Pod 3 ready," or something, and it's basically a modular portion of the ship, which Yondu purposely blows the ship up. But before he blows up Taserface, but before Taserface dies, he sends a message off to the Golden people, because they need to go, and he basically sends them the message of how to get to Yondu's, not Yondu, Ego's planet, so that they can kill Yondu and the rest. So they go, and after they escape, they basically meet up with Peter. Well, they meet up with the other Guardians on Ego's planet. Now, in that time, Nebula has actually gone and tried to kill Gamora, and they basically have this little fight where Nebula tries to kill her with the ship she stole, and then there's a few other sections. There's a really cool section where they shows Gamora with basically a mounted gun that fell off the starship, and she has it mounted on her shoulder like a massive oversized bazooka, and she's just riddling the ship with bullets. That's honestly a really cool scene. But they have this kind of sister moment where at the end of it, it's one of the few moments in the film that's actually not ruined by out of place humor, where Gamora is arguing with Nebula, and Nebula they're having this whole thing back and forth thing about how Thanos like tortured Nebula, and Gamora just like always wanted to win. It didn't matter; she always wanted to win. And Nebula says, "You always wanted to win. I just wanted a sister." And it's a kind of like a heartfelt moment. It's touched on again at the end of the film, but it's one of those little heartfelt moments that really works, and it sets up for a bigger moment later. But then, of course, after that, they wind up finding. And this is also a kind of a weird thing. Again, this film is supposed to be relatively comedic, and if they didn't play up the comedy so much, I wouldn't mention this. But there's a scene in there where Nebula and Gamora find out why exactly Yondu did not bring Peter to Ego. And the reason for that is because Ego had killed all the other children that he had brought, because apparently Ego basically went to a bunch of planets and impregnated a bunch of female aliens in order to try and find a species that could replicate the celestial DNA. And humans apparently were the only ones that could do it, i.e., that's why Peter is there. So the other ones he killed because they were useless to him. And we find out basically that Ego has essentially been putting on this fatherly act in order to gain Peter's trust until he can manipulate his mind enough to use him to help him conquer the galaxy, because all these little nodes that Ego has planted on these worlds are basically they're celestial powered, but he needs another celestial in order to do it. And Peter is powerful enough, so he uses him essentially as a battery to grow these nodes out, and eventually he will take over the entire world that the node is on. And the whole point is that he wants to basically spread himself across the galaxy, which is really weird and creepy. Um, but you know, going past that, we have a few scenes with Yondu and Rocket that are on board the ship, and there's a really good speech that they have in between each other, where Yondu essentially says that the two of them are very much alike, because they act tough and they try to push people away, but in reality, all they really want is for people to care about them. And it's a very very good and interesting message to have on that. But what winds up happening is that Rocket basically realizes that he has been a complete jackass for the entirety of the film, and he wants to make amends by saving Quill and saving the rest of the Guardians. And the end of this movie has a lot of heartfelt moments, but the reason why I bring up the child murder is because you go from dick jokes to kids getting murdered. That's a bit of a jump. That's a bit of a messed up jump, and I'm aware that the movie's supposed to be semi-serious, but they don't play it that way. They don't play it that way at all. They play a majority of it up for jokes, and then you have this, and then it's like, okay, we're kind of going way in the other direction, where there's just and they literally find a mound of bones from all the dead children that Ego has killed, his own children, which is, again, it's messed up. So, going forward from that, basically, Ego also admits that he put a tumor in Meredith Quill's head to kill her, so he would never have a reason to go back to Earth until Peter was ready to come with him. Um, and this is what sets Peter off. And I don't know why Ego would bother saying this. It's very, very odd considering that he knows the attachment that Peter Quill has to his mother, and unless he's just so overconfident in his hold over Peter, because Peter immediately snaps out of the trance that he's in and begins blasting Ego's form out just completely. Um, but that it the motivation for saying that, I feel, is more generated towards the audience rather than in the film. It's like, oh, we need clarification. He basically, James Gunn feels like he's almost trying to give clarification. It's like, oh no, she didn't just get cancer naturally. She Ego had to give her cancer because they need a reason at the end of it to kind of snap Peter out of the whole celestial trance thing that he's in. Which, again, I think it's a bit much. I don't think it's really necessary. It's like, all right, we just need to cement Ego as the bad of the bad guys. And I kind of get it, but it feels a bit over the top. Um, but this is when we hit the final battle where it's the Guardians versus Ego, and they basically figure out that they need to blow up Ego's brain, which is at the center of his planet. So they dive underground using this like mining laser thing, which actually it's really really cool looking. It's an interesting thing. So Yondu and the Guardians and Mantis all go down there to try and blow up this brain. And essentially, what happens is they're able to stall Ego for a time. The Purity guys show up. The Golden people, they show up and try to muck up the whole thing. But they wind up getting pretty much murked near the end by the drill machine. And again, the drill machine is actually really awesome. It's one of those kind of things that's like it it shouldn't it's a very small part of the movie, but for whatever reason it really does make any scene that it's in, just because of the way it's constructed and the way that it works. It's just a bunch of laser beams and rolling metal balls that fire lasers. It's really really cool. um, so again, the visuals in this movie, the CGI, for the most part, is really good, except for one scene. And again, I'll get to that a little bit later because it's almost the final scene of the movie. But uh, basically the Guardians are at one point they're about ready to lose. They're all getting overwhelmed by Ego until Peter Quill essentially awakens his celestial powers almost. He fights off Ego from, he fights off Ego, and he uses his celestial powers to kind of push Ego back and like take his attention away from the other Guardians so that they can get their stuff done. And the song that plays during this scene is actually really really good, and it's "The Chain" by Fleetwood Mac, and it's really, really, really good. Where it just has that opening kind of guitar strumming at the beginning, and it's like kind of this slow build up until Peter Quill and Ego start going at it and start beating the shit out of each other, and it actually works really well, and it shows that the only thing that I don't really care much for in the scene is the idea that Peter really hasn't done a lot with his celestial powers. He's created a few little light things, but he really hasn't done a whole hell of a lot besides that. But then suddenly in this scene, he just has omnipotent power and he just starts beating the shit out of Ego. Now it is a bit. Uh, you can track a bit of it up to emotional motivation, where he wants to just kill this guy because he knows that he killed his mom. So I get that. I get that in a way, but it doesn't explain totally like why he's able to do some of the things that he does. But the battle ultimately between them, it's not very good in terms of the visual effects. The visual effects are lacking a little bit. It looks a bit cartoony at times when they show it. There's a couple other little small scenes in the movie that have that too, but they're not as noticeable as they are in that final fight, where they're kind of flying at each other Dragon Ball Z style, and they're beating the living crap out of each other. And then there's actually a really cool scene where it shows Ego. He forms like a rock body or something around him to like bash Peter with, and Peter flies towards him, and he creates Pac-Man, and he even has the sound effect and stuff, which is kind of funny. It's one of those things in that final fight that's like, okay, there's a little bit of humor there to kind of break everything up, and I get that. Um, but ultimately, they are able to blow up Ego's brain and escape the planet. Unfortunately, during that, Yondu is killed because he gives an air shield to Peter so that he will survive in space. But Yandu, basically, in doing that, he sacrifices himself in order to save Peter, who he essentially considers his son. And it's kind of the message at the end of the movie. Again, I wish we had had more development with this over the course of the film, where we get kind of these. We don't really get very many flashbacks with Yandu and Peter. You know, we don't really know much about their past other than Yandu essentially abducted him. Um, and but if we look, you know, we get one little flashback scene where Yandu is teaching Peter how to shoot his blaster rifle. But that's really about it. We don't get to see anything else. And I would have probably liked to have seen some more flashbacks, maybe like an entire scene that's set when Peter's a kid or something like that, to kind of reinforce that Yandu wasn't just an abductor; he was a father figure. Um, and you know, because at the end of the film, Peter essentially accepts that Yandu was in reality his real father because he raised him, as opposed to Ego, who was essentially absent until very recently in his life, even though biologically he is Ego's son. Um, but you know, there's a whole thing over the course of the show of the movie where you know, again, the whole thing ties into Yandu, where we find out that Yandu essentially was bringing these kids to Ego. Ego said that you know they were his biological children, and he needed to find some things out about them, and he said that he wouldn't hurt them, even though he was murdering them. Um, but because of this, the other Ravagers exiled or you know cut ties with Yandu because the part of the Ravager code was they don't deal in kids. And now at the end of the film, Yandu has basically he's come full circle and he's helped destroy Ego, who was the one that he basically you know he's basically corrected his mistake almost in a way because he's destroyed Ego. So at the end of the film, they have what they refer to as a Ravager funeral, where Ego is essentially incinerated in the exhaust pipe of the ship, which is a little weird. It looks a bit like, kind of like a cremation thing. Again, it's kind of strange, even though like there's a lot of colors and stuff involved. And at the end, the other Ravagers show up and they give him what is referred to as a Ravager funeral, where they all do the little Ravager salute, and they shine bright lights and stuff from their ships and stuff. So, um, you know, and ultimately the movie kind of it's shaky for me. It's shaky as a sequel. You know, again, and it's hard to do comedy sequels. I get that. It is definitely hard to do comedy sequels, and this is for the most part, for the majority, it is a comedy. And it plays off some jokes from the first one. It plays off like the body part jokes from the first one, and some other stuff. But ultimately, the point of the film, which is to kind of be the action space sci-fi thing, it falls short on the comedy because the comedy is overused and used in places where I don't think it's necessary, and I think it takes away from the scene. And I've heard people complain about that with some other films like Thor Ragnarok. It's like, oh, the comedy ruins it. I felt that Thor Ragnarok was very balanced in terms of comedy, much like the first Guardians. But I felt that Guardians 2, the balance was not equal. The balance, you should have an equal balance because both of them should kind of work in tandem. They didn't work in tandem in this movie, and it feels like there's a drastic shift, especially when you get to the end when you find out about the child murder stuff. So, you know, the film has issues. The film does have issues, but the character development is good. I like the character development with Peter. Gamora and Nebula have a few moments. Rocket has a lot of development in this. Yondu has a lot of development in this. Groot's kind of just there. But and then they introduce a few characters that are really shallow. You know, Mantis, we don't learn much about her other than her purpose there and her powers and stuff like that, and her interactions with Drax. We don't really learn too much about Drax, except they have this neat little moment where he's talking about his daughter. And aside from that, we don't get too much development for some of the characters, but most of them we get some form of development, which I think is good. I think you need to do that in the sequel, and I think they did a decent job at doing that in this movie. And then also introducing character death, because the first one we didn't really have any character death because Groot comes back at the end. It's one of those things where like, oh well, he's not really dead, he comes back, but Yondu is dead. Yondu is 100% dead at the end of the film, and it's a major character death because they made him a major part of that movie. It's not like, oh, we killed the side character. Um, because that's really all he was in the first film, as a side character. But in the second one, he is pretty much a main character in the film. And Michael Rooker does a great job at playing him. I love watching Michael Rooker play him. But when he dies, you feel it because they've established him more and more throughout the film. And the way that he dies, basically in Peter Quill's arms, is, it's almost poetic. But I do have to take points off for the tone and the humor that doesn't hit, because the humor is a major portion. So if I was going to rate this movie, I would have to rate it 4.8 space distortions out of 10. So thank you again for listening in. If you have any thoughts, put them in the comments. And next time we will be going into Spider-Man Homecoming, which is the first MCU-related Spider-Man film to be released, with Tom Holland returning from Civil War to play Spider-Man. Marissa Tomei as Aunt May, again returning from Captain America Civil War, and introducing Michael Keaton as the Vulture. So, like I said, we'll go into that next time. That review will be out tomorrow. Thank you again for listening. Like I said, leave your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?